Okay. Lastly, I would like to give some sense of the Victorian period, the culture and social history and background from which all of this emerged. You'll have to excuse me. I'm speaking a little bit off the cuff on these topics. I have a degree in history. I know a lot about these. But I'm sure there will be things I forget, things that I do not explain very well. I apologize. The Victorian period lasted from 1832, right? See, I'm already reading it. 1832 to 1901. And it's a huge swath of 19th century British history. And it would take a whole year, a year's worth of classes to cover this period. But there are various trends that I would like to point out and to discuss. So it's important to remember kind of what happened with the Romantics and the Romantic period. The Romantic period, generally, scholars like to start it around the start of the French Revolution in 1789. Early on, many of the Romantics were enthusiastic supporters of the French Revolution, and they saw it as ushering a new age of human dignity and of equality and reason, what the Romantic understanding of reason is, for mankind. However, after the terror and the French Revolution and the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte and the Napoleonic Wars, many Romantic authors became extremely conservative and renounced their original allegiance to the revolutionary ideals of the French Revolution. This will be important for understanding the Victorians for several reasons. First of all, many of the Victorians were drawing off of this legacy of what I call romantic conservatism. In in Romanticism, you see a criticism of capitalism, but it's not a socialist criticism of capitalism. For the Romantics, capitalism is something ugly. It is not beautiful. Therefore, it must be hated. It's not because so much of the inequality and the wealth that's created, which would drive critics like Marx and other socialists during the Victorian period to criticize capitalism. For Romantics and some of their Victorian heirs, capitalism was something that just was not beautiful. They loved to contrast the ugliness of capitalism and the lives of the working class with this kind of idyllic, ideal life of the peasantry and the lord during the Middle Ages and medieval times. So there's this deep kind of conservatism that we see in the Romantics and in the Victorians as well. You especially see this in Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, whom for most is a periphery figure, but he's probably the most important intellectual of the Victorian times. We just won't have time to discuss him. But he very much celebrates the simple joys and the easy understanding of social relationships and man's place in the universe during the Middle Ages and during the pre-Raphaelite movement, the same thing. So you see in the Victorian times this conservatism that very much looks towards the past as a time of order and as a time as a time of beauty too. And I think that we still see these romantic ideals in conservative thought today, which idealizes the past rather than focusing on, for lack of a better way to say it, how much the past sucked for most people. Okay. Also during the Victorian times, we see a rise of a kind of modern liberalism and also modern progressivism. Both of these would be reactions against what happened with the fall of Napoleon. So when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the countries who banded together, Britain, Prussia, Russia, a whole bunch of them, Austria, they established what was called the Holy Alliance. And essentially the Holy Alliance had its goal of stopping any revolutions at all from taking place in Europe and of turning back the clock and keeping Europe set in the early 18th century mode. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, and there was a deep repression going on in all the countries in Europe, even in Britain. I believe in 1819, there was a famous massacre. It's called the Peterloo Massacre, in which the British Army injured hundreds of British citizens who were protesting working conditions and starvation. So for the first 15 years or so after the defeat of Napoleon was extremely conservative, extremely repressive time. In 1832, Britain would pass the first of its many reform acts throughout the 20th century, which slowly extended the franchise so that by the end of the 19th century, all male citizens over the age of 21 could vote. And it reformed a system wherein it's a little difficult to explain, but they had what were called rotten boroughs because the maps of who would be representing each other were drawn so long ago that there were some areas where maybe two people lived, but they got to elect a citizen, a representative for parliament. So there were various reform movements that took place in Britain to extend the voting franchise and to create a better, more representative system. This would be part of these progressive movements that you see in Britain during this time. You also have various movements like the Chartist movement, which seeks to create not only constitutional government, but labor unions and things like this. So the rise of the proletariat, the rise of the working class becomes a central concern and begins to kind of shake up politics in a way that it hadn't done before. So the effects of the Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century in Britain, began to have political consequences in the Victorian times. Also during the Victorian period, we have to remember there are many revolutions that take place in man's understanding of the world and his or her relationship with the world. Of course, Copernicus in the 16th century, 15th century, would publish his model of the heliocentric view of the universe, which was a blow to humans' pride because we thought ourselves at the center of the universe and that literally everything revolved around us, but it didn't. It took hundreds of years for people to accept that the Earth actually does revolve around the sun, and obviously the Catholic Church and the Inquisition fought against this for over a century after these ideas became popular. But, eventually they became accepted. During the 19th century, however, science began to further undermine traditional truths in the Bible and really undermine traditional authority by doing this in ways similar to what happened with Copernicus. The first thing that happened was advances in, of all things, geology, the study of rocks and fossils. Sir Charles Lyell, I think the guy's name is, he published about his findings with fossils and rocks and determined that the age of the Earth, and for him it was just millions of years old. Now we know that the Earth is about 4 billion years old and the universe is about 14 billion years old. But you have to remember at the time, most Christians believe the Earth to have begun with Adam and Eve. And if you trace the descent of Adam and Eve in the Bible, you arrive to an Earth that's about 5,000 years old. So when Lyell would argue that the Earth is millions, and later people would say, no, it's billions of years old, this shook the foundations of biblical history. And you see in a lot of the Romantics, I'm always thinking about them, and a lot of the Victorians, they are struggling with this new knowledge and what to do with it, this erosion of traditional authority. In many ways, the liberals and the progressives are going to offer a model to respond to this new world, as well as the conservatives, but this is more of the aspects of history that I'm not going to get into. But it's important to remember that at this time, there's a great degree of uncertainty, whereas before, with concepts like the Great Chain of Being, people understood their place in the universe, they understood universal biblical history, they believed in a very strict literal interpretation of the Bible. So many of these new scientific theories of the day shake these to the core. After Lyell, famously, you have Charles Darwin, who would prove with his theory of evolution that humans were not uniquely created, that we descend from other species in a competition for scarce resources. This theory of natural selection. The theory of natural selection is going to be very important on how progressives and conservatives view cast the world. For many, people wanted to reject Darwin. Darwin created a world which seemed to be devoid of any compassion, in which we are all struggling for scarce resources, and only those who succeed survive and pass on their traditions, pass on their genes. The rest of us are condemned to toil, to suffer, and to die. I don't really feel like discussing the theory of evolution and and where I think that some of the more pessimistic views of it are incorrect. But you can imagine going from believing, again, just like in Copernicus's days, that man is the center of the universe and that we are inspired and towards a final purpose and mission from heaven, from God, to believing that we are all essentially animals fighting over scarce resources, trying to kill each other in order so that our seed can create the next generation. And again, many Victorians would struggle with these new sciences. We see this especially in Tennyson's poem In Memoriam. In Memoriam is a very long poem. One of Tennyson's friends had died, a very close companion and associate of his, and Tennyson is harking back to a famous poem by Milton called Lycidas. Same thing happened to Milton. One of Milton's friends died while sailing, and Milton writes a poem reflecting on human nature and the nature of loss and these sudden tragedies. Of course, for Milton, it's much simpler and much easier because Milton lives in a time before the theory of evolution, before the rise of the middle class, really, before the rise of the working class, surely. And it's much easier for Milton to place his faith in the gospel, in the Bible. In Memoriam, we see Tennyson struggling with these new ideas that arise during the Victorian times. He famously writes, so careful of the type, but no, from scarped cliff and quarried stone she cries, 1,000 types are gone, I care for nothing, all shall go. This is nature talking. You see with the scarped cliff and quarried stone, this ancient rock, millions of years old, doesn't care if we suffer. 1,000 types are gone, 1,000 species are gone. What does nature care? Nature does not care about our loss. Nature is not hostile. Nature does not care. And for Tennyson, this is, you'd much rather have nature that hates you because at least there's some reason. And Tennyson struggles with this a lot in Memoriam. Nature goes on to say, thou makest thine appeal to me, I bring to life, I bring to death. The spirit does but mean the breath. I know no more, and he shall lie. Man, her last work, who seemed so fair, such splendid purpose in his eyes, who rolled the psalm to wintry skies, who built him fanes of fruitless prayer, who trusted God was love indeed, and love's creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravine shrieked against his creed. So here we see him talking about this opposition between what he sees as the natural world and the natural order and God's order. Nature is violent and, in his view, irrationally cruel. And whereas before we could trust in God's providence, that everything would work out. And the Victorians are struggling with this new science in the same way many people still are today. But the Victorian era is the first era in which this kind of new modern science really begins to have an impact on the artists during this time period. Also, during the Victorian time, we see how to explain a kind of idea of a clash of moral and aesthetic values. This would be most famously developed in in Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, in this poem Dover Beach, will look at the world in much of the same way that Tennyson does, and say that it's cruel. Our belief in these kind of universal certainties that give truth to our experience are no more. But Arnold writes, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." So here we see Arnold, he's arriving at a kind of subjectivism. He's seeing the armies clashing at night. He's seeing the world, which was once so beautiful, but now all of the myths, all the things that made beauty in the world have been dispelled, but we still have each other. So Arnold is celebrating this. And Arnold and many other writers, they're interested in building something from what they see as kind of a rubble of civilization as an anarchy. This is going to later lead into people like T.S. Eliot and even some theories of fascism. But we can see these poets and these writers, they love to write about culture. They love to write about Matthew Arnold's most famous critical work is called Culture and Anarchy. And he's trying to create a synthesis out of this kind of new world that we live in. The medieval age synthesis is gone of the great chain of being, and where do we go from here is an extremely important question during the Victorian times. And we see this in the politics. So you have various progressives. The progressives, I don't want to make this political, but you can imagine that progressives are pushing for a Bentham idea of a utilitarian principle, which argues the greatest good for the greatest number. Human beings many of them are optimistic about the new technology and the way that new technology is creating opportunity and wealth more rapidly than ever before in human history. However, you also have conservatives who view the decay and decline of the British aristocracy and landowning class, who see the rise of urban working poor and are aghast by this, and they wish to turn back the clock to a simpler time. And again, you can kind of divide poets up into these different categories of being a progressive, someone like John Stuart Mill, very much in the progressive camp, or a conservative, somebody like Carlyle. Matthew Arnold was also a guy we consider a conservative poet. Tennyson, I think, to a certain degree as well. So you start to see kind of these modern political and cultural battles that we still argue about today really achieve their first prominent expressions during the Victorian period. Also during the Victorian period, this is, of course, the heyday of the British Empire. By 1901, maybe like 1910, I'm thinking, Britain would control 25% of the Earth's landmass. So this is a time in which Britain achieves the height of its power before World War I and World War II. And again, for the optimists, you see this imperialism is seen as a good thing. Rudyard Kipling would famously write A White Man's Burden, which if you read it today, it's appallingly racist. But the idea of the white man's burden is essentially that white British people have a responsibility to leave Britain, to put themselves in danger, to possibly die, to educate all of the poor savages around the world. So progressives like Rudyard Kipling, had a belief in this progress and optimism. The Victorian period mainstream had a belief in science, in progress, and optimism. And of course, there were the conservatives who questioned these values. But for the most part, people were trying to build a new world and a new synthesis of understanding the world off of these new discoveries in science and technology and capitalism. And it's important to keep this in mind as we're reading about the period. Of course, near the end of the Victorian period and in the decade leading to World War I, we will see a lot more pessimism and a lot more despair creep into British thought, British thinking, and British art. But in spite of all of the political turmoil which characterizes the Victorian period, we do see a slow progress of the expansion to vote, of wealth being created, etc. And this idyllic dream of the Victorian period will come crashing down because of World War I and also because of inherent class conflicts between the new working class and the middle class, but this is a little outside of our realm. So anyway, I hope this was helpful in understanding some of the social and intellectual currents that were going on during the Victorian period. I'm sure I've talked too much about inconsequential topics, but I've told you I'm just kind of going off the cuff here. So anyway, have a good night, everybody.